Good afternoon, Your Excellencies, Ambassador Fabrice Fillier, Ambassador Joe Tyndall, Ambassador France Perez, Chief Negotiator Mr. Joseph Teo, Center for International Law Director Dr. Nilofer Oral, and all participants. My name is Danielle Yao, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this highly anticipated dialogue. We will hear from our distinguished panel of speakers for their take on the results of COP26 and the road ahead. After some nail-biting moments, COP26 concluded in Glasgow close to midnight on the 13th of November, 2021. Since then, there have been numerous commentaries and articles offering a spectrum of views on the success or failure of COP26. In particular, whether COP26 has significantly moved the world closer to the emissions reductions necessary to save the Earth from irreversible cataclysmic global warming. What lies behind the headlines? To start off our dialogue this afternoon, may I first invite His Excellency, Ambassador Fabrice Fillier, Swiss Ambassador to Singapore, to deliver his opening remarks, followed by Dr. Nilofer Oral's opening remarks. Ambassador Fillier, over to you, please.
Thank you. Dear Nilofer, dear distinguished panelists, dear colleagues and participants, thank you for joining us today for what I hope will be an insightful discussion on the outcome of the Glasgow Climate Change Summit. COP26 ended less than 2 weeks ago, and as you all know, the negotiations leading up to the final outcome document were as intense as they could get at a multilateral conference, with last-minute maneuvers and changes. I also hardly need to underline the stakes associated with Glasgow. The IPCC's 6th assessment report painted the bleakest of pictures. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, in delivering his keynote speech, implored delegates to stop the world's addiction to fossil fuels, and that unless we wanted to keep digging our own grave, as he puts it, we better get radical in our approaches to climate change. It is hard to disagree with his shake-up call. I don't think it is exaggerated to say that implementing the Paris Agreement is the defining challenge of our generation. Against this background, we cannot have enough webinars on Glasgow, and I'm delighted to welcome such an illustrious assembly of panelists in this one. All 3 panelists are seasoned climate change negotiators. I'm very much looking forward to hearing their insights. Before handing over to you, Nilofer, I wouldn't miss if I didn't congratulate you on your well-deserved re-election to the United Nations International Law Commission. And thank you for co-organizing the webinar with us at the Swiss Embassy in Singapore. So thank you very much, and I wish you great success.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Fillier, for your remarks. May I now invite Dr. Oral to deliver your opening remarks.
Thank you so much. Dear Ambassador Fillier, dear Fabrice, Your Excellencies, distinguished panelists, dear colleagues and participants joining us from around the world. As director of the NUS Center for International Law, it is my great pleasure to welcome you and thank you for joining us today for this webinar that follows on the heels of the very much anticipated meeting of COP26 in Glasgow. For decades, scientists had been warning us of the future consequences of climate change, as far back as in 1989, when the small island states issued their first warning about sea level rise. We are now in that future period, and we are now living those warnings of the multiple adverse consequences of climate change that impacts all parts of the globe, developed and developing countries. The Paris Agreement was a turning point in bringing together states to agree upon a common temperature goal, a collective pathway to reach it, and it was intended to be an all-inclusive agreement. Unfortunately, in the 6 years since the Paris Agreement was adopted, progress has been slow, yet the real-life impacts of climate change are speeding up. We are facing challenges, indeed, some that may reach security levels. About a month ago at the UN Security Council area dialogues discussed the security challenges of sea level rise and climate change. Today, we are extremely fortunate to have highly seasoned climate change negotiators to explain some of the key outcomes of the Glasgow summit and share their views. Now, before closing my comments, I would like to express my sincerest appreciation to the Swiss Embassy in Singapore, especially Ambassador Fidesz and Nicholas Sterkler, who inspired this panel, and for their cooperation and partnership. I hope together we will continue working on these vital issues. And lastly, dear Fabrice, thank you very much for your kind words. The International Law Commission is also working on climate change through its study group on sea level rise, and it will remain one of my priorities as a member. So I now pass the floor to my dear CIL Climate Change Program lead, Danielle Yao, who herself was a climate change negotiator and will be our moderator today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nilufer. Thank you for that. And thank you, Ambassador Fidesz, for those important key opening remarks that will set the stage and the context for our discussions this afternoon. It is now my pleasure and my privilege actually to turn to our distinguished panel, who between them have a wealth and storehouse of knowledge and depth of experience on the climate change negotiators. Now, in the interest of time, I will briefly introduce each of our speakers and invite the audience to please view their full bio in the links provided in the original announcement. And thank you also to our audience for the active participation and the questions we have received in advance. And I invite you to continue your active submissions in the chat function. Now, I'll first introduce Her Excellency Ambassador Jo Tyndall, who is New Zealand's High Commissioner to Singapore and was most recently New Zealand's Climate Change Ambassador, where she headed New Zealand's delegation to the climate change negotiations. She co-chaired the UNFCCC ad hoc working group on the Paris Agreement from 2016 to 2018. His Excellency Ambassador Franz Perez heads the International Affairs Division at the Swiss Federal Office on the Environment. He represents Switzerland's international environmental policy abroad and leads the Swiss delegation at international environmental negotiations, including, of course, the climate change negotiations. Last but not least, Mr. Joseph Teo, Singapore's Chief Negotiator for Climate Change since 2018. He is a career diplomat and has held various appointments in Singapore's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, including as Singapore's Deputy Permanent Representative to the UN in New York, and also previously as a Deputy Chief Negotiator for Climate Change negotiations. So indeed, we're very privileged to have all three with us today. I'm looking forward to a very interactive dialogue today. And perhaps to start off, I would just pose the first question, which I will invite Ambassador Perez to perhaps first start off on our conversation. There has been a lot been written on this. Let's begin with the UK presidency's goal of keeping 1.5 degrees alive and setting the roadmap for the world to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030, which scientists say is needed to cap global temperature rise at 1.5 above pre-industrial levels. The question here is, how would you rate COP26 versus that benchmark, versus that target? Was it a success or failure in your view? And did it achieve what it set out to do? Or indeed, what you as a chief negotiator had set out to do? May I first invite Ambassador Perez to share your thoughts on this? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and thanks also for organizing this seminar. I think it's really also exciting for me to have an assessment of this COP by the two Joes, by Jo Tyndall and Joseph Teo, of this important COP in Glasgow. just directly to the question, ambition and keeping 1.5 degree in reach, that was one of the three objectives, I think, of this COP. And from my perspective, I think the UK presidency did succeed in keeping 1.5 degree in reach. It's clear we are not yet there. This is clear, but it's the expectation with each COP are that with one step we will be at 1.5 degree, but that's not neither the function nor is that something that the COP can deliver in one step. This 1.5 degree objective is something you have to reach step by step. But I would say the rails were put again in the right direction in Glasgow, so that if we continue building the rail tracks, that we will be able to reach 1.5 degree objectives. And there are for several reasons. First of all, I think because we took some quite ambitious decisions also with regard to the national NDC. So countries are invited to revisit their NDC, for example, for Switzerland. That will be a challenge. We are challenged to do that, to look again at our NDC and to see whether we can increase it. And we have all countries are invited to formulate long-term strategies. I think that is one of the important tools of Paris also that brings us towards 1.5 degrees. And then also numerous initiatives have been launched, and some of them have a potential to make a difference. So I think as a package, the rails again were put in the right direction, and we had the possibilities to reach 1.5 degrees. This objective is reached.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Perez. May I now perhaps ask Mr. Teo, Joseph, from your perspective, do you share that view? Were there other elements you think you want to highlight in terms of your own assessment of the success of COP26?
Thanks, Daniel. And again, like France, I would like to thank the CIL and the Swiss Embassy in Singapore for organizing this webinar. I want to also say that Switzerland and Singapore are good partners and have been working well together in the climate change circuit. So it's a pleasure for me to be on the same panel as France. We work well together at COPs, and it's great to be with him again in a panel. And of course, Joe as well, who we all know very well. Straight off to your question, I think maybe I'll preface it with a couple of comments. The first is entering COP. We all knew there were high expectations. The UNSG has even issued a code red. So all delegations knew that they had to deliver something. But at the same time, we all need to be aware that we knew that COP26, this COP, would have been a very different COP. It's a COVID COP. And given that it was a COVID COP, the way we organized meetings or the way the meetings were organized was very, very different. And that sort of set the scene also, or set the bar as to how difficult this COP would be in terms of reaching agreement. And we also knew that this COP was supposed to be held a year before, but it was postponed. So it had 2 years workload of issues to cover. So I would just like to put both of these points across just to underscore the context upon which parties were entering into Glasgow. Now, the reality is that each COP is a process. And as Franz said, it was not supposed to end off with a big bang. Each one, in fact, is supposed to build on the results of previous COP. So, and I think not many people understood or understand that particular point. So the issue then is to try to keep the process alive, building on each the results of previous COPs, and try to keep the process moving forward. And I think if we look at it from that perspective, Glasgow did deliver on a number of counts. But before I go into that, I think we should acknowledge that there has been some criticisms about the results of COP. Yes, we did not reach the 1.5 degree, and we should, and the Glasgow outcomes did acknowledge that. Yes, we still have not reached the 100 billion goal. And again, the Glasgow climate package did not shy away from that fact. But acknowledging these two shortcomings, I think the Glasgow outcome did deliver on a number of counts. And I think I have quite a number of points to share, and I hope you indulge. So I have actually 8 points to share. And the first, of course, is the big outcome at Glasgow was the adoption of the Glasgow Climate Pact, as everyone now know. And for Singapore, at least as a small city state, one of the biggest outcome for Glasgow Climate Pact that in my view was significant was that it strengthened the multilateral approach to addressing climate change. For me, that was a big takeaway. The US was back, played an active role. John Kerry himself went about to try to encourage higher ambition from many other parties. Second point related to the strengthened multilateral approach is that we have now Turkey and Iraq joining the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement is 4 countries short of universal ratification. And I think based on your team, again, looking ahead, where we have an Egyptian COP coming up, I think if I may suggest to the Egyptian COP, they should try to work on the 4 remaining countries, Eritrea, Iran, Libya, and Yemen. And I think these are countries that they have good closer to and are more familiar with. We should try to push for universal ratification. And the third significant point about multilateral approach to addressing climate change is Glasgow co-opted the private sector involvement. And the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero was delivered a significant commitment in Glasgow and has reinforced and realigned their practices towards towards the goals of the Paris Agreement. And I think all of these factors just is very encouraging from a small country's perspective, because it shows that the multilateralism is alive and that there is a will to work together to address this common challenge. So that's my first takeaway from the Glasgow outcome. Second outcome, which was significant, is that COP, as Franz highlighted, saw the emissions gap closing. So yes, we did not reach 1.5, but it is significant that almost 85% of global emissions and over 90% of global GDP are now covered by mid-century net zero commitments. This is an important point. So there is a report by IEA, and yes, the UNFCCC NDC synthesis report did give a more dire warning. But according to IEA, if all these climate pledges announced to date are met in full and on time, it will be enough to hold the rise in global temperatures to 1.8 degrees. So not quite 1.5, but as I said in my preface remarks, with each COP, if we can make the same progress, there is hope that we can keep 1.5 alive. The third point, third takeaway from Glasgow is that it has mainstreamed 1.5 as the global temperature goals. And as for all close watchers of climate change and the Paris Agreement, you would have noted that there is a debate. Is it well below 2 degrees or is it 1.5 degrees? And we always go back to the Paris Agreement, and based on agreed language, you have to read the entire line in its entirety, well below 2 degrees, 1.5. But at COP in Glasgow, there is a line in the Glasgow Climate Pact which says parties resolves to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5. I think this will shift the bar in favor of 1.5, and we will have more and more countries using this as the benchmark upon which to measure progress. The fourth takeaway from Glasgow is that it has institutionalized processes to ratchet ambition from all parties, and quote and inverted quote, in this critical decade. So the idea then is recognizing that we're not there at 1.5 yet. It has put in place a number of processes to try to get countries to do better in the immediate years ahead. So prime on the list is getting countries to revisit and strengthen their 2030 NDCs by end of 2022. Whether all countries do so, that remains to be seen, and that's the challenge of the Egyptian presidency. But for Glasgow, they have managed to include this, and there's a whole array of other issues. We have annual ministerial meetings to discuss pre-2030 ambitions. We have calls for NDCs and LELs to be updated, etc., etc. I won't go into detail. You can look at the outcomes yourself. The fifth takeaway, which is quite significant, and it's one that Singapore is proud to have played a small part, is that after 6 years of negotiations, we have managed to complete the negotiations on the Paris Rulebook. And it's a big relief, believe me, for Singapore to be able to land a deal on Article 6. I think that's important. Apart from Article 6, and the Article 6 the rules will actually help usher in a new era of government-to-government cooperation that is meant to scale up investments in climate action while protecting environmental integrity. And I think that's an important point to highlight. Apart from the Article 6, we have also finalized the common reporting tables and formats. Yes, it is not sexy. We're talking about technical work and tables and format, but these common tables and formats will facilitate the implementation of the Paris Agreement by all in a fair and a transparent way. And I think that is another important point to highlight. And lastly, of course, in terms of the Paris Rulebook, we have managed to reach agreement on a common 5-year timeframe for successive NDCs post-2030. And this will help to better align the pledges with the Paris Agreement ambition mechanism, all of which are meant to encourage ambition over time. I know I'm going too long, but there's a lot to say. I've got 3 more points, and the 6th, I believe, takeaway for me from the Glasgow package is that it has delivered a stronger package of measures on adaptation and loss and damage. Responding to the calls of developing countries, I think it is only a right for me to also highlight that at Glasgow, there was the highest single mobilization to the Adaptation Fund. And I think we need to acknowledge and welcome and thank our developed country partners for their contributions to the Adaptation Fund. Developed countries have also agreed to at least double adaptation finance by 2025 from 2019 levels. Again, we need to acknowledge and welcome this call because it has been quite a number of years since developed countries have made such a commitment. And it just shows that they are responding to the needs of developing countries who have asked for more attention for adaptation, and they have got some of that commitments in Glasgow. Apart from these 2 very significant announcements, Glasgow also launched a 2-year Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program to operationalize the global goal on adaptation. And again, the baton has been passed to Egypt, and hopefully in Egypt we'll be able to come up with some concrete recommendations. And lastly, of course, under the adaptation and loss and damage point, developed countries have also, and all parties have also agreed to fully operationalize the Santiago network for loss and damage. Last 2 points on the takeaway is the 7th point, if I count correctly, is that they have established a work program to deliberate on the new collective goal on climate finance for post-2025. And included in this is we're not forgetting about the 100 billion goal. There was also a decision to extend the long-term finance work program to 2027 so that we continue to keep our eye on the ball on the 100 billion goal and to make sure that it is met. And lastly, and significantly, not the least, COP26 also spotlighted the important role of non-party stakeholders, in particular youth. And I think that was another important takeaway for me for the Glasgow. There were engagement between ministers for the first time and youth, not only at pre-COP, but at COP itself. And there is a decision in the Glasgow Climate Pact which encourages future COPs to organize such interactive sessions. And not to forget, Glasgow also launched a work program on action for climate empowerment to galvanize ground-up action and to enable more community partners to join in the pursuit of sustainable development. So all in, I think you can look at the outcome of Glasgow as half empty, as some critics have done, or you can look at the Glasgow outcome as half full. And I've identified a number of significant points, at least to my delegation. And I just end off by saying, ending where I start off, which is each COP is not supposed to be an end in and of itself. It's supposed to build on the outcomes of previous COP, and Glasgow have put forward a significant package of issues for future COP, including Egypt, to consider and to bring the work forward. So thank you.
Thank you very much for your remarks. It just really sets the stage for the discussion today and raises several points which I wanted to probe further with our panelists. So thank you for bringing in advance. But I think the key, if I may find the key points from your intervention relates to the multilateralism, the incremental process in a way of managing the expectations and the outcome. It's just how you viewed it, an incremental process rather than a big bang. Going to Glasgow, honestly, there was a lot of big bang, big expectations and anticipation and build up. And against that context, a lot of critics and assessment whether or not it actually delivered on what has been anticipated. You raised a few key points in terms of the outcome, such as Article 6, common timeframes, which I will then turn subsequently to Ambassador Perez, who has specific viewpoints on Article 6, which I'd like to invite him to share later. But before we go back to Ambassador Perez, may I now take this opportunity to turn to Ambassador Tyndale, really taking a look from the outside in. You were involved in the process earlier, very much involved as a member and co-chair, in fact, of the ad hoc working group. Looking back, looking forward, did you find the outcome satisfactory? Did it match up to the intentions at the inception of the Paris Agreement? And honestly, why has it taken us so long to come to this point? And even then, it hasn't really met the complete goals that were set up. May I invite you to respond to those comments first? And then I will definitely want to turn back to Ambassador Perez for his views. Thank you.
No, thanks very much, Danielle, and thank you, CIL, and to Ambassador Fabrice as well for organising this. And you can take climate change out of the girl, but you can't take the other way around. You can take the girl out of climate change, but not climate change out of the girl. I would agree with the points that that both Franz and Joe have made. There is no such thing as an easy COP. And getting 164 or 165 countries to agree, even on what day of the week it is a bit of a challenge. So it is an incremental process, always. There is no such thing as a COP that doesn't go beyond the 11th hour, and sometimes it goes well beyond the 11th hour, days, in fact. I think Durban took the record so far. And every COP has similar priorities attached to some key issues, for example, around finance for developing countries and how to manage the need for flexibility for countries that lack the capacity and capabilities they feel are needed to deliver on climate change commitments. So COP26 was no different in many respects, but even if multilateralism moves, and I know it's a bad sort of phrase to use in the context, even if it moves at a glacial pace, it does move. And the issues, the attitudes, and the dynamics have shifted seismically, I reckon, over the period of time since France and I both became involved at exactly the same moment, July 2010, in the UNFCCC process. Now, I think, as both have said, there was no COP last year, and that's the first time in the UNFCCC history. And attempts at virtual negotiations at this level of involvement with the sheer number of parties who have skin in the game, as it were hugely challenging in the pandemic environment. So there was a lot of pent-up desire and a need to show demonstrable progress. So I think it was hugely important that despite the pandemic, big numbers registered, apparently the biggest ever, although I thought Copenhagen had been bigger, or even Paris. But nonetheless, big numbers participated. Despite the pandemic, climate change hasn't dropped off the agenda. In fact, it's almost the reverse. There's been a reminder that there's not just one global problem we all have to deal with. And I think what's happened is that the evidence has become clearer and clearer with each IPCC report and the observed experience, that was a few years ago largely governments and a comparatively small number of NGOs, but now the active and influential groups are growing. And Joe referred to youth, for example, but small island states, business, the finance sector, and a whole lot more. I think I just wanted to make two key points. So first of all, it's worth remembering that if it weren't for a big fight and push by the small island states back in 2015, 2 degrees would have been the goal reflected in the Paris Agreement. 1.5 was added in with a great deal of pressure fairly near the last moments of the COP. And what we have seen subsequently and are seeing is that with every 1/10 of a degree of increase in average global warming, the impacts are catastrophic and getting worse. So I agree, and I think it's truly important that the 1.5 degree goal has raised in its significance and importance. I think it was great that the COP president, Alok Sharma, was able to say, even if he thought it was with a weak pulse, the 1.5 degree goal remained alive at the end of the conference. That's really super important. But I want to put in a small word of caution that ambition, big, hairy, audacious goals, if you like, are critical. But if they're set too far in the future, which of course they need to be, it can mean they're left as aspirational for future governments to deal with. As you said, Joe, even if everybody did everything that was promised, we're not out of the woods. We're at best at 1.8 degrees. So long-term goals, whether it's by governments, the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero, or whatever, need to be backed up by clear policy plans. We can't wait until 2049 to begin work needed to achieve net zero by 2050. So the policy plans have to be clear, consistent, and well communicated. They have to be thought through as kind of mainstreamed or normalized as part of government policy or company policy or whatever policy to avoid unintended consequences. And that's not an easy process. So there are two things I think that are important there. One, which I hope Frans will get back to as well, is the criticality of the Paris Rulebook being finished. The transparency framework is vital. You can't manage what you don't measure. So getting the transparency framework sorted out is the first step towards governments being able to measure how they're doing against their NDCs and to start putting in place policies to make sure they can deliver on them. So we need to see action on that. And I also wanted just to give the example quickly of New Zealand, which is strongly committed to taking ambitious action on climate change. We know we're a small emitter by global standards, but equally on a per capita basis, we don't measure up too well, and we have to do a lot of work. We have spent the last 4 years developing and implementing a slew of policy changes, the centerpiece of which is our zero carbon legislation, aiming to get to net zero by 2050, but also, and I'll just run through these incredibly quickly, setting up an independent climate change commission to provide advice to government on 5-yearly carbon budgets, which the government either has, and the policies that would allow those budgets to be met. They've done so through to 2035, 3 5-year budgets. We've set up a green investment financing facility with seed funding of $400 million. We've put in place policies to nudge people towards electric vehicles and away from the internal combustion engine. We've made changes to our emissions trading scheme to make it more effective and send clearer price signals to change behavior and business. We had a 1 billion trees initiative established a couple of years ago. We've invested heavily in research into agriculture because that's our big problem area with methane emissions from livestock. We have run multilateral or mini-lateral initiatives around fossil fuel subsidy reform and pulled a small group of countries together to develop an agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability. We've developed a hydrogen strategy. We've quadrupled the amount of climate finance we are committing to and delivering to $1.3 billion, which is big for New Zealand. And we've upgraded our 2030 target to aim to reach net greenhouse emissions reduction by 50% by 2030. That's just a super quick run through one tiny country trying to put in place a series of coherent policies to make sure we can deliver. These things take time, and countries just now have to get on, get started and do it, and use the framework of the Paris Agreement rules to help them achieve it.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Tyndall. I think your comments are very important in highlighting that after the hype and after the dust has settled from Glasgow, the hard work actually continues to remain in front of us, both on the individual country level in what needs to be done. And I was very happy that you raised this, because this is really part of the question on after COP, what's the landscape, what lies ahead for countries individually, and what lies for the world globally as a community. And I will be very happy to touch on that in the subsequent discussions. May I now turn back to Ambassador Perez. You've heard Mr. Joseph sharing his thoughts on the key takeaways. We've heard from Ambassador Tyndall in terms of what she considers, in terms of a comparison as to how this process started and to where we are now. I'll turn to you again and invite you to comment with those viewpoints. Has COP been successful? What do you consider to be key takeaways that maybe differ, or where you may agree or disagree in terms of the points that were flagged earlier, in terms of where we go forward? Multilateralism, of course, is key. We saw that resurging, and certainly being on the ground in Glasgow, there was certainly a palpable air of, I would say, positive constructiveness, and that seems to be the buzzword in the corridors. That delegates were so happy to be back again and meeting each other and congregating. Did that contribute to the positive environment, in your view, that really helped to move the process along? Because we're catching up on 2 years of discussions and a very, very full agenda. What do you think about that? And then perhaps then you could then address, in particular, the comments about the completion, or rather the importance of the Paris Rulebook. Why is that so important? Article 6 in particular, are you satisfied with the outcome of Article 6? Thank you. Over to you.
It's working, the microphone again.
Yes, it is.
Thanks, because I'm muting. Thanks. So, first of all, I would agree with much what Joe and Joe both have been saying. Most important, I think Joe would very well when she was saying that we can't wait until 2049 to deliver on the net zero targets which have been presented. I think that is important. That's important why these COPs are important, regular steps moving forward. And that's also important why transparency is so critical, as Joe was also indicating, because we cannot only manage what we cannot measure, we also need to see how we progress slowly and constantly towards the net zero, and we cannot postpone our efforts. And I think Glasgow was really another push, not to postpone, but to continue to act, and to continue to act immediately. As Joe has just been saying, we have to revisit now our NDCs again this year or next year, and that is that constant pressure is important. I think when I would look at the overall outcome from Glasgow, I would say there are 3 different areas where it did deliver. That was on ambition, it delivered on rules, and it delivered on finance, on all of these areas. And these are also the 3 areas that were also the criteria for success for Glasgow. And it was able to deliver on all the 3 areas. Ambition, I was mentioning before, and both Joes are referring to it, by calling to revisit the NDCs, by insisting also on the importance of long-term strategies, but also by mentioning coal. Of course, there was a certain disappointment that the wording used for it was now phased down and not phased out, but it's the first time that coal was mentioned, and this mention of coal and of fossil fuel subsidies initiative New Zealand indeed was launching with its friends of fossil fuel subsidies reforms. I think with this statement about both coal and fossil subsidies, that was an absolutely clear signal to investors. I think after this COP, after that clear statement of phasing down coal or phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, it's clear investors, you can't invest anymore reasonably into these technologies. So that is quite well. And all the initiatives that were announced showed also that it's going the right direction. Rules, I will come back on that. On finance, Joe was mentioning it. We delivered this initiative, this deliberation of a new goal, a finance goal, which we really hope that will be a different kind of a goal that will be formulated, not a number that is just coming from like a Deus ex machina from somewhere being imposed as a new target, but a goal that is really delivered on a bottom-up process that is addressing the important elements of effectiveness, of needs, of access, of transparency, but also of equity, how this new number has to be delivered. So this is a good process. We were not able to achieve the 100 billion. Yes, that's true. That's a disappointment, but at least we had a delivery plan, how we should reach it now. And we have agreed to double adaptation financing, so also very important signals on financing. But then rules, and that's at the end the core of these COPs. the core. That's always when I come back and have to explain to my mother or to my children that what did you really do? They were always expecting that in one step we will save the world, and they try to explain, well, our work at the COP is to deliver the rules, to refine the rules. Because these rules will determine what will be done over the next years. And they're absolutely critical to make sure that we are able to achieve the 1.5 degree target. And there we were really, this was on rules-wise, this was a very successful COP. On markets, on transparency, on common time frames, but also in setting into March the global stocktake, which will be another step in its dynamic cycle of the Paris Agreement to increase ambition over time. That was really a success. Let me just this time focus on markets, and then I come back in the later rounds on transparency and common time frames. As Joe was indicating, Singapore did play a critical role there, because Singapore was facilitating together with Norway. Already in an early stage, they started to facilitate already before June to find a solution at ministerial level. And that was a novelty of this COP, that the ministerial process started earlier, not only in the second week of the COP, but it started early, that two ministers, a pair of ministers, were mandated by a presidency to raise a topic at ministerial level, to start to interact at ministerial level and to reach out to countries and to test the waters to find a landing ground. That was a novelty in the process, which I think probably was also really helpful to be able then to land something as difficult as markets in such a positive manner. But in order to understand the importance of Article 6 and of the implementation rules, I think we have to go back to Paris. And in Paris, that was one of the difficult issues to be negotiated, this Article 6. Because there were so many different views, emotions, political ideologies and views attached to this idea of market mechanisms. Some arguing that market mechanisms are something of the devil, because it's a symbol of capitalism, who are not really delivering in work, but just pretending to deliver and in reality not deliver anything. But others saw it as a true instrument that can increase the potential of our efforts, including Switzerland, I think New Zealand, Singapore. We all belong to those who think that markets can be a critical tool that helps us really to increase ambition. But markets need certain basic requirements. First of all, they need rules that ensure additionality. They need also absolutely rules that ensure that there is no double counting taking place, and rules that ensure transparency. Without these rules, markets can become a fig leaf. Markets have to be understood not as something that is replacing inaction, replacing action and pretending that we do something while in reality not doing something. It's a tool that helps us to do more than what we can do at the national level, at the domestic level only. And for Switzerland, it is an important element, because Switzerland is when we look at our emissions, our per capita emissions with a little bit more than 5 tons per capita are very low compared with many other partner countries. We are about country number 101 in the ranking per capita. So our per capita emissions are much lower than the one of China, for example, and of Mexico, of most of the G20s. We have very low per capita emissions. That means also the lower the per capita emissions are, the more difficult it becomes to rapidly reduce your emissions. But still, we want to do more. We want to do more. We have to reduce our emissions. We have to move towards net zero. But the big steps will become more difficult and more difficult. So we try to do more than what we can do in short term at the national level. And we can do more by using markets, by helping emission reductions somewhere else in the world. In addition to what we do nationally, so it's not a replacement of what we do nationally, it's in addition to it. So we are able to do more than what we can do only through domestic policies. But it has to be absolutely clear, these emission reductions have to be additional, and they can be counted only once and not twice. So after Paris, when this Article 6 was agreed, that sets the framework, for transparency, for measurability, and for no double counting. We were not sure still whether whether we will be able to deliver that multilateral mechanism that we have decided in principle in Paris. Paris foresaw 2 tracks on markets. One is Article 6.2, which foresaw cooperative approaches between countries, bilateral or in smaller groups of countries. Countries can come together and develop bilaterally, for example, a regime, how they together reduce emissions in one of the countries and then share that success, that contribution between the two countries. And the other is 6.4, a multilateral mechanism that is building a regime that is delivering certificates of emission reductions that then can be traded and used by everybody. Switzerland has formulated the target to reduce its emissions by 50% by 2030, but also indicating that part of that target will be delivered by measures outside of Switzerland using market mechanism. But we were not sure whether this 6.4, this multilateral mechanism, will be in place in time so that we can use that mechanism in order to achieve our target. And that's the reason why Switzerland started to engage in bilateral agreements with a number of countries, and we were then developing these bilateral agreements in order to have bilaterally a framework where we can reduce emissions in partner countries in addition what they would be able to do. So aiming for the high-hanging fruits in these countries and then using parts of these emission reductions also as a contribution to our nationally determined contribution to our national target. We were progressing well with the bilateral negotiations. It was not easy because we wanted to have robust rules for these bilateral agreements that ensured additionality, measurability, and so on, and no double counting. But we were able to deliver and to agree on such agreements with Peru, with Senegal, with Ghana, with Georgia, also with Vanuatu and Dominica. We have now concluded a row of such bilateral agreements. But we were very concerned that if that whole Article 6 remains only on bilateral agreements, then that is not robust enough. Because we are not sure that whether all the partners will follow the same standard that Switzerland was setting with their agreements. That's the reason why we really wanted also to have multilateral rules, both for Article 6.2, setting the standard, following the high standard of Switzerland for all the other such bilateral approaches, cooperative approaches, but also setting a multilateral mechanism that is also following the same standards of no double counting and so on. In Katowice, that was where we were supposed to deliver on these implementation rules. And remember that very well when we were not able to come to the positive outcome there. And then I remember very well when the COP presidency was trying to present an outcome in Katowice, which from our perspective was not sufficiently good, because it would have allowed, at least for an interim phase, for double counting. And that was something that was absolutely red line for Switzerland. So together with the small island states and ILAC, we were able then to prevent that outcome and block that outcome in Katowice, which had the consequence that we just continued to work on that. In Madrid, then 1 year later, again, we were not able to agree on the market rules. There for different reasons, because Brazil, India and China were rejecting the proposal there, seemingly because of the share of proceeds, but perhaps the main reason of rejecting the rules in Madrid was because from their perspective they were probably too ambitious and too robust with regard to no double counting. And now in Glasgow we were able to deliver on these rules in a very robust manner, in even more robust manner than we would have been able to deliver in Madrid, and I think that is a huge success. So we were able to set a standard that really prevents double counting between NDCs, between countries. So it will be impossible that the same emission reduction will be used by two countries for their achievement of their nationally set target. That's a first really important step. Secondly, we were also able to prevent any double counting between NDCs, between nationally determined contributions and targets by countries, and multilateral systems like CORSIA or whatever might come in the area of maritime navigation. So there will be no double counting. And thirdly, we were even able to set up a mechanism that is delivering certificates for the private market without double counting or double claiming, so that the private market can have access to emission reduction certificates which include a corresponding adjustment, and these emission reductions will not be used by any country for achievement of its targets, so that the private company can use it with good conscience for its emission reduction claims. And I think that is pretty impressive that we're able to deliver such a strong outcomes on markets without any transitional period, starting right away. So I think that was a big success. And this is a success that will also be critical to bring us closer to the 1.5 degree objective, because it gives us a tool, a sharp tool that helps us to cut emissions together using the forces market mechanism, and that will also speed up our potential to reduce emissions globally. So I think this outcome was perhaps it's technical, perhaps it's not something that is well understood and well explained and easy to explain to everybody, but it might have a bigger impact than assumed today by many. And I think that is really one of the big successes of Glasgow.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Paris, for really bringing us through an area which is very technical, to be honest. A lot of the key policy issues are lost sometimes in the technical debate. And thank you very much for bringing us through that, because indeed that was one of the most highly anticipated aspects of COP26. And a lot were even saying the success or failure of COP26 hinge on the ability to agree on the rules for carbon. Indeed, there are a lot of significant industry interest in this. The growth of the voluntary carbon market has been quite exponential in the last 2 years. And the industry themselves are calling for clear, predictable rules in order to drive the significant investments that are needed to this area. Many states in the NDCs, as you pointed out, did cite recourse to Article 6 carbon market as one of the key tools to meet the NDC targets. But of course, let us not forget, civil society has indeed criticized the Article 6 rules as nothing more really than the fig leaf, a simple mechanism for countries to continue their pollutive activities and really buy their way out of real emissions mitigation. So to that extent, the rules, robust rules on issues like corresponding adjustments, share of proceeds, overall mitigation of global emissions are really critical in overcoming, I would say, these objections. But maybe this is a good segue, if I may, to turn back to Joseph, if I may, because this brings us to the process of the negotiations. Very much intimately involved behind the scenes in Minister Grace Fu's co-facilitation of this. Were there particular conditions that helped in achieving success? Were there particular difficulties and obstacles that perhaps are not so visible to those outside of the process? Useful learning points that could be shared, useful key considerations that helped. One of the questions in particular I had was whether or not I would say, some say the fairly well-timed announcement of the US-China joint statement, almost at the last few days of COP, did that change the mood in the room? Certainly among delegates, some have actually felt that really changed, was the influential factor in an intangible sense in reflecting this desire to move the process forward. I wonder if you'll be able to share your perspective on the process-related issues.
Thanks, Danielle. And before I answer your question, I just thought I just respond to some of the other points that were made by Joe and Franz. I think, as they have mentioned, the rule book, and I think Joe in particular, Ambassador Joe in particular, would appreciate and would be happy that after 6 years, the Paris Rulebook is completed, and it started under her leadership. And so we have a lot to thank her for starting the process and getting it right. And I'm glad that at the other end of the table, we were able to bring the race across the finishing line. And right now, the proof is in the pudding, and we have to, as member states, implement these rules and show that they are working. And that would be the challenge for all of us in the months and years ahead. So yes, the transparency framework is equally important. It was really a mind-numbing exercise going through tables, technical tables and columns, and deciding what to do with them, how much to report or not. But in the end, we got a decent and sensible deal. And these reporting tables will help show the world that every party of the Paris Agreement is actually implementing their commitments or not. And the emperor will be seen without its clothes eventually. And that would really drive ambition and action on the ground. And I think that is understated importance of the Paris Agreement rulebook. So back to your question, I think whenever the US and China reaches an agreement on an important deal or cooperation, it is always welcomed by all parties because they are, after all, the major two emitters. And I think that agreement itself, I would say, is important and significant because it points the way forward. And the way forward is to, and if you look through the agreement includes an accommodation of interests and concerns from both sides. So it was a very well crafted agreement. It has a little bit of things that the Chinese want, and there's a little bit of things that the US side wants. And so that really shows the nature of the mutual accommodation. And I think that is a significant point to highlight in the agreement. The other point to highlight is it tries to go a little bit beyond what is agreed in a Paris Agreement. So, and in that agreement, one important gas was mentioned, and that is methane. And both countries, again, in that agreement, have agreed to see how they can work together, help each other to bring that emissions down. And that is important. Did it affect the negotiations? I would say that in the Article 6 negotiations itself, the early signs of progress were achieved actually prior to the release of that agreement. And we were very happy that the US have reached out to Brazil to see how their concerns and interests could be addressed. And they were able to come together to identify certain parameters upon which we can resolve some of the thorny issues that were identified in Madrid that helped progress up in Madrid. And that pertains to inside, outside, how do you define an NDC, as well as how do you decide what year to opt out and when do you apply the opt-in or the opt-out. And it helped also that other parties came forward with new ways of trying to solve this issue. And here I want to also acknowledge the contribution of Japan, who actually came forward with an interesting proposal of user authorization, which really then sparked a debate about how can we relook things, how can we do things differently and try to solve this issue. And that's where the co-facilitators' role played an important part. The co-facilitators sensing that there was this interesting proposal, and there was traction between the US and Brazil, and we brought that proposal into the fold, into the formal or informal negotiating process, tested it out with different groups and parties to see what the reactions were. And fortunately, we had a good reception, and there was a willingness on all parties to try to look at this proposal anew and see how it can help move things forward. And then through many rounds of iteration and meeting with different groups and parties, we tried to improve on the proposal and got greater mindshare on it. And I think that helped to move. There were other sticky issues like the share of proceeds. Obviously, money is always a big issue that is difficult to solve. But again, there the co-facilitators have come forward with ideas and proposals as to how to solve these issues. We put them, and as well as the overall mitigation, which is another big issue of concern in the Article 6. We brought this forward to the presidency, and the presidency then, looking at the entire wider package, were able to do the necessary how you put it, give and take across different issues, which enable us to reach an agreement on Article 6. So I think without betraying some of the other inside issues that we have dealt with by various parties, I thought that is the way that I can share with you about how we made progress on Article 6. But again, coming back to France's point, I think the Article 6, the key outcome from Article 6 is, number one, it provides clarity of accounting rules. And there, I think it is very clear, once the host country issues a letter of authorization, it will require corresponding adjustments from participants of that particular agreement, and that is very, very clear. And that avoids the issue of double counting. And the user authorization proposal helped us overcome this issue of what's inside and what's outside, and whether or not to have an opt-out period. So as Franz has highlighted, from day one, this will apply. There's no opt-out. From the get-go, this is the rules that will be applied. So clarity of accounting is one big achievement to emerge from the Article 6 outcome. Second important outcome from the Article 6 negotiations is we have agreed on more stringent baselines. So we have raised the bar, and now if you want to participate in Article 6.4, you have to abide by these higher standards of baseline requirements. And that in itself, again, will help to improve, bring emission reductions that are needed. The third important outcome from Article 6 is that the new 6.4 mechanism builds on the CDM and have included improved reporting and review processes. So again, this process itself will help to ensure that there are higher standards and that entire environmental integrity will be preserved. The fourth key outcome from the Article 6 is that parties have agreed to a higher share of proceeds. So that's a 5% mandatory share of proceeds contribution that will go immediately to the adaptation fund, which provide new sources of funding for adaptation, which will then help to raise the adaptation ambition that is so much needed also. And lastly, of course, which is a big call by the small island developing states, there is an agreement, a mandatory agreement on the overall mitigation emissions of a 2%. Yes, it fell short of what they had wanted, but it still shaves off 2% and will have a 2% savings of emission reductions from any activities that comes out of the 6.4 mechanism. So these are just some noteworthy points that came out of the Article 6. Again, very pleased that Singapore and Norway were able to play a small role, but really, end of the day, it was really the UK presidency that brought it all together, and I want to acknowledge and commend their leadership on this, as well as the mutual accommodation and the support from all parties, because it was really with all parties that we were able to come to this deal, an important deal in Glasgow. So thanks.
Thank you very much for sharing what you could of what happened kind of behind the scenes, behind the closed doors, so to speak. There is a lot of interest, certainly, particularly among the observer delegations who were, for space constraints, certainly like many delegations, for state party delegations, really unable to participate in physical meetings, so to speak. And so I really appreciate that. But what you bring up in your comments was a key point, which I wanted to flag also to the Ambassador Perez and Tyndall for your comments, which is that really Article 6 is just one part of the overall equation, part of the trade-offs, which perhaps only a president who was able to pull off at the end stages. And that Article 6 was a deliverable. But I think, how does that balance against how do you see this in the balance on the three pillars of adaptation, finance, and mitigation? Because there remain a lot of, I would say, criticisms and disappointment over the failure of, or rather the lower than expected delivery in terms of the outcomes for, say, climate financing, and also for loss and damage. China and the G77's proposal, for example, on a financial mechanism did not appear in the final text. Would this poison the atmosphere? How can we address what continues to be fairly strong underlying concerns about these two key points, which are important in the overall pillars for delivery? So we're very, very curious about your views on looking forward to the next COP. How can we use this time, how do the leaders use this time to address two burning issues that remains very, very strong undertone, very strong undercurrent of disappointment, and some even say resentment in this overall package. And perhaps then also address the more systemic question, if I may, given that there was a very prominent parallel process, if I may say so, prominent process in the proliferation of unilateral and plurilateral political commitments on the sidelines of the COP agenda. So we mentioned the beyond oil and gas. We've talked about the leaders' declaration on deforestation, the global methane, the Clyde Bank Declaration on green shipping, for example. Now, these are catalytic events, catalytic initiatives, so to speak, by a smaller group of countries with the intention of perhaps mobilizing wider momentum. But are there systemic questions over whether, despite the good intentions, this could actually end up to greater polarization and fracturing? The other related question is, how does one, and in fact, this is also a question from one of the participants, how do we bring these processes into the COP? How do we bring that into the NDCs? How do we hold countries accountable for those pledges, which I think Joseph has also mentioned, if you take all that into account, would actually help really bring the world to below 2%. I would be curious for your views on that. Perhaps Ambassador Tyndall, would you like to start off, and then
well, Danielle, you've asked a multitude of questions there, and I would begin by saying that, well, in fact, I said it in my opening comments that these issues around finance, adaptation, loss and damage come up at every COP. There is incremental progress. Issues, a number of issues were settled under the Paris Agreement. And it's important, I think, not to unpick the Paris Agreement, but to look for ways forward that help kind of overcome some of this disappointment, or even, as you say, resentment. But it is always an incremental process. We have determined what is going to be in NDCs. We have determined a number of other issues in relation to loss and damage, for example, around compensation, that can't and shouldn't be renegotiated as part of the Paris Agreement. But that doesn't close the door for progress to be made on the issues of concern to a number of countries in other ways. I wanted to make a couple of, because I don't know what time we're due to finish, but I don't think we've got much more time left.
Yes.
I wanted to make a couple of other points in reaction to comments and questions you've raised. First, in relation to the joint statement by China and the United States. While it would not have, I agree, impacted directly on something like the Article 6 outcome, if we did not have the United States and China cooperating, we would not have had the Paris Agreement in the first instance. It would not have happened. So I think it was symbolically hugely important to the kind of dynamism of the whole process that the US and Paris under John Kerry and the same negotiator for China, Xie Zhenhua, were able to put other bilateral differences aside, and work together to cooperate on climate change. On Article 6, I agree absolutely with the points that have been made. I just want to make two important points that, you know, in terms of why Article 6 had to be done. No country wants to achieve their NDC completely by means of, you know, purchasing offsets on the international market. All that amounts to is a massive transfer of wealth offshore. And it does not, it means that you just don't deal with a problem. You're forever having to put a bigger and better NDC without actually, somebody likened it once to paying off the interest on a credit card only, and never getting around to dealing with the principle of the money you owed or what you owed in terms of mitigation. So that's important. The second thing is that we're in a different situation now than we were under the Kyoto Protocol. Under the Kyoto Protocol, there was a clear set of buyers and sellers in the market. And the buyers were those of us, Annex 1 countries, who had commitments under the Kyoto Protocol. Under the Paris Agreement, that division is no longer clear. So Article 6 is going to operate in a very different way, and with a different set of participants than was the case under the Kyoto Protocol. The last thing I want to say is around the future. You know, we've talked about the shift of and the expansion of interest at the COP that saw a huge number of people, whether it was official delegates or NGOs there, driven by different motivations. Now, to me, whether it's a question of intergenerational justice, moral duty of care for the environment, seeing the writing on the wall for fossil fuels, or indeed seeing real business opportunities in areas of renewable energy or whatever. Personally, I don't care what the motivation is. The fact that you're seeing people coming together, action is what matters, whether that's action by governments, by cities, by business, by civil society, and that's all mutually reinforcing. We have the makings of a virtuous circle, I think, established by the very deft leadership of the UK at COP26 and the hard work done by the ministerial co-facilitators that Joe's talked about. So we should square that circle. I'm an optimist by nature. I'm excited by the degree of convergence that I could see from the outside. Of course, I wasn't in the rooms and knowing the tensions that were there. And while it'll take time to turn the super tanker around, that is the global economy, the change then will not be linear. I really hope for exponential change. The way we've seen the cost curves on renewable energy drop at speeds much greater than had ever been predicted. So I'm very hopeful for the future. And I think it's in those sort of areas, as well as dealing with the unfinished business that is always there from any COP, and that will need to ensure that we draw on finance and support from a whole range of different sources. That $6 trillion per year is not all new money, as I understand it. A lot of it is about shifting investment that was already going to happen, if you like, shifting it from brown to green. And that's what we need to focus on now to ensure we can deliver properly, not only on our 2050 targets, but our 2030 targets as well.
Thank you, Ambassador Tyndall. You spoke very well to the role of the the non-state actors, I think, who have increasingly come to the fore, and what each individual, a corporate, NGO, individual can do in this process. Can I invite Ambassador Perez to come in on your thoughts on this? Does the involvement of private sector, for example, reflect a trend that leads the way in what were previously normative activities in the domain of states between now and Egypt, the next meeting? What do you see in the landscape?
I'm happy to answer to that question, but then I'll also come back to your previous question. I think the signals in Glasgow have been pretty strong, and now we have also a new tool available. It will not be in place immediately with these credits, which include the corresponding adjustment for private actors, which will be really make it even more attractive for private actors to engage. I think most importantly, Joe said, well, is it the signature on the wall that we were reading or whatever? The signal, I think this COP has shown that the tanker is moving in a certain direction. And businesses, whatever the motivation is, if a business wants to remain profitable and make benefits, it will note that the tanker is changing direction. And so I think we will not see that immediately within 1 year. That's the businesses are also small tankers, but we will see these changes. In Switzerland, we have started about 6 years ago a voluntary scheme where investors, pension funds, banks, investors could analyze their investment portfolio and to see what would be the carbon impact of their investment. That was a purely voluntary scheme where they could just better understand the impact of their investment. And it was really interesting to see how businesses were making use of that voluntary scheme. And then when 5 years later, they could do this analysis of their portfolio again to see how over 5 years changes started to take place in these businesses. It's more than 80% of all investors, pension funds and banks in Switzerland are now part of that voluntary scheme. And that shows there is an interest, there is an eagerness of businesses to do things right. And not only because of their reputation, because wrong investments are also an economic risk. So I think also this COP again was giving a very clear signal to the private sector. I'm convinced that they will now even move faster in that direction. Let me just pick up two things from your previous questions. The one is the importance of the US-China deal, and I fully agree with Joe Tyndall when she was saying it's always absolutely critical, and also Joseph Theo said it. It's always important and helpful if these two big actors, they're still the two biggest emitters, if they find a way forward how this problem could be tackled. But at the same time, I think it's also to be aware why we cannot deliver without these tools being also part and trying to help to find solutions. Letting things to them alone would also not be helpful. So in the lead of Paris, this work between US and China was absolutely critical. But I would say similarly critical were, for example, the Blue Skies meeting that you, Joe, were organizing in New Zealand. That brought together a small group of negotiators to think out of the box. And they were as critical as well for that. For markets, for example, I think the Rigi meetings have been important, or the Singapore dinners that Joseph and I are organizing. There are small elements that also help to deliver on ambitious outcomes. Let me also come on your other question on the disappointment that some are formulating with regard to adaptation, loss and damage. I think Joe was hinting to that already. First of all, there are also disappointments in regards to mitigation. I think, for example, Article 6, we were looking at the positive things. There are also negative or not entirely positive elements, like, for example, the huge carryover. They have agreed on the carryover, which is 8 times the annual current annual emissions of Switzerland. How can we explain in Switzerland that we have to reduce our emissions if we just agreed to dump something that is 8 times our annual emissions as certificates into new markets that do not reflect any additional emission reductions? So that is one of the elements where we clearly are not happy. Or about that naming and claiming issue that has not yet been resolved, that we will have to resolve if you are having unauthorized certificates that do not include the corresponding adjustment. Can these certificates be used by the private sectors for mitigation claims? We think not, and that is an issue that remains on the agenda. So also on the mitigation area, we were not living up to all our expectations. And I would say on adaptation and on loss and damage, we made huge progress. I agree fully with what Joe has been said. We have negotiated in Paris a basic agreement, and with that agreement and framework, we are now to work. We cannot undo that and change it. We were not able to agree in Paris, for example, on binding emission reduction targets. And if we now would come in and ask, make proposals for binding emission reduction targets, that is just outside of Paris. And that's the same thing with regard to adaptation and regard to loss and damage. Certain things were not agreed upon in Paris, and that's not a part of the package. But we were able to make significant progress on adaptation, not only on the doubling of the adaptation funding, but also, for example, in a 2-year program to better understand adaptation goals. I think this 2-year work program, that is a step forward. That is really also very positive, and that will help also to address the important, very important adaptation concerns. On loss and damage, we had this dialogue that should deliver also already perhaps in a year on loss and damages. So that is also that we are not delivering in one step, but we are creating a framework that helps us to better understand the challenges and to better understand what could be really effective solutions. And loss and damage, for example, the transparency scheme which you have agreed upon now, the rules which you have agreed upon now in Glasgow, includes many elements of loss and damage nobody would have thought of when we were launching these negotiations. So I think we should, like in mitigation, we should not only look on all our dreams and wishes which we would have had that Glasgow should deliver. We should also see what Glasgow has delivered, and also on adaptation, on loss and damage, and on financing, like on mitigation. I think Glasgow was delivering important elements. And let me, because we're running out of time, make a very last point, picking up on what Jo Tyndall said in her first intervention, I think, when she said that we have to act now, and every degree of temperature, of global temperature increase that is happening means additional catastrophes. I think building on that, I would say every 10th of degree that we're able to prevent an increase of global temperature is a huge success. Whether we are now already on 1.8 degrees or on 2.4 degrees, if all the elements of all the NDCs are implemented, I think gradually, since before Paris, we were able to come from a pathway that was beyond 4 degrees, about something that is clearly under 3 degrees, and each 10th of the degree in temperature increase that we can prevent with our measures is a huge success. We try and have to try to get to 1.5, but even if we get to 1.8 or to 2.1, that's much better than more than 4 degrees increase. So I'm also absolutely optimistic from that perspective. Each year we'll be able to bring the global temperature down a couple of tenths of 1 degree, and that's already a success. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Perez, for a wonderful summary of what goes ahead. Now, I know we're very short of time. I will just give our panelists an opportunity to say in one sentence, between now and the next COP, what do you think, or what you would like to see, or what do you think Egypt as the next president needs to do? One sentence for each of one of you. Perhaps we'll start with you, Mr. Teo, Joseph Teo.
Thanks, Danielle. One sentence. Wow, that's a challenge.
1 point.
I would just say that in Glasgow, we have made a lot of paper gain. I mean, we have made a lot of pledges on NDCs, on the LEDs. We have finalized the rules. I think the challenge really is to translate all of these paper gains, as I will call it, into actual gains on the ground. And I think if we can deliver tangible gains on the ground, it will help assure many of the critics out there that we are making progress. And on the issue of loss and damage, it is befitting that Egypt is hosting the next COP from an African perspective, and adaptation is high on its agenda. And again, if you look at the outcomes at Glasgow, there's a lot of work on adaptation and on loss and damage that we have to do. And mind you, the UK had 2 years to achieve the gains that it has achieved in Glasgow. The clock is already ticking and we have less than 12 months before the next COP. And that will be a big challenge for Egypt to deliver the progress on adaptation and the loss on damage that is so much needed. And I know that's more than one sentence, but I pass it over to Franz and Joe.
Okay, over to you, Ambassador Tindall. Would you like to share your point of view?
Well, I think that it's like Joe, it's important now to turn words into action. So governments need to go back and make sure that what they have signed up to, they can start to put into effect. I think that Egypt will need to be very clear early in the year about its objectives for the COP. And I would sincerely hope that it's going to be possible for meetings to be in person next year, because Zoom is all very well, but nothing beats being in the room for the dynamics and the possibility of finding constructive bridge building compromises to get to a good solution.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Tindall. And over to you for the final word, Ambassador Perez.
Thanks. I would agree with everything, but let me just add three elements. The first is, I think one of the top priority for next year will really to engage in a very positive manner in that new finance process to deliver on the post-2025 target. That is a 4-year process or 3-year process, and we really have to do that well. With submissions, we starting to engage. That will be one of the top priorities. The second one will be on Article 6. We will continue to work. I think that naming and claiming of the certificates that are not authorized will be an issue which for us remains a priority. And the third element for me, building on the last point from Joe Tindall, is one of the top priority will be to see Joseph Theo in Tokyo. That is not the first meeting, because that makes a difference really in person to think through, to digest Glasgow and to plan for the year. And also linked to that, one of the priorities will be to see Joe Tindall either in Singapore or somewhere else, just to also to interact and to see you once again, because yes, we are missing you.
I'm missing the process too.
Thank you very much, everyone. Again, indeed, it's a meeting of friends and close counterparts that work very closely. I'm sure, like everybody else, we appreciated very much you sharing your insights. Perhaps to cap it off, reality, strictly speaking, it was probably a very tall order for COP26 to achieve everything everyone wanted, but there was something in it for everyone, and something that everyone's also a little bit unhappy about, that work remains ahead. Nonetheless, there's positivity over the outcome of the consensus, the completion of the rulebook. And now what is key now is to move into really translation, the paper, as Joseph said, paper gains, paper commitments, moving into implementation, moving in operationalization, because that is what's going to be critical in addressing any remaining doubts or suspicion and criticisms over the process. Actual implementation of the NDCs, for example. Can we expect more political pressure to accelerate the progress? Will we see more visible impacts of climate change in 2022? What will be the report coming out from the completion of the 6th assessment report of the IPCC, which we can expect ahead of the COP27, which will be possibly another key factor in play. So lots of questions, but lots of very useful insights and suggestions and inputs. Thank you very much to our 3 panelists for their very important contributions to this discussion. And thank you to the audience for your attendance and also for your questions. The recording will be available thereafter on the CIL, Facebook, and YouTube. My thanks again to all my 3 panelists. Thank you, and a good day to everyone.